Okay. Good evening and welcome to our first General Practice Summit, which is a follow-on from the 3 workshops that we held in the summer. And the purpose of today's session is to summarize the outcome of the workshops, hear from different stakeholders involved in general practice decision-making, and to have an opportunity to input into some discussion also at various points in the evening. It's great to have representation this evening from the ICB, the LMC, PCS, PCNs, practices. I think we acknowledge that there are many challenges in general practice at the moment, and it's important that we as a group, having different priorities, work together to show the system what general practice can do. And hopefully this will be a start of conversations that we have at citywide level to see what we can offer the system to support our local populations. But before I hand it over to Andy Hilton to start us off to give us the context for this evening's session, I just wanted to run through some ground rules for this evening. And these are the ones that we used during the workshops and found extremely useful to focus and guide our discussions around. I'm not going to read it all out for you. So Neil, if you could put the ground rules up, that would be great. But I just wanted to summarize the principles on which these are based on. And one is to please listen to each other. We all have different perspectives, and it's important that we hear each other out. 2 is have a mindset of collaboration, mindful that we are all working towards the same goal. And 3 is to participate, mindful that every voice counts. So can I ask that if you have any comments or questions that through this evening, please feel free to use the chat function, and you will be invited to participate in discussion at 2 points through the evening as per the agenda. And please raise your virtual hand if you wish to speak. I will now hand it over to Andy Hilton, who will give us a bit more detail as to why we are here this evening. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Sharuba, and thanks to everybody for giving up your evening after what I imagine has probably been a very busy day. We very deliberately did this online this time, having done the 3 face-to-face workshops back in June or July. We thought that we might be able to engage more people and have different colleagues attend. We always intended to have a citywide summit to build on the workshops. It's a bit scary how quickly it's come around since the summer. For those of you that attended the workshops, there will be a bit of recap this evening. Ollie in a moment is going to go through what we did there, just for those that weren't at the workshops, but hopefully not too much repetition, hopefully an opportunity to progress our thinking. So why do this? Why have the workshops? Why have this evening? A number of us in leadership roles felt that there was a huge amount going on at the moment in terms of system change, in terms of strain on practices. And we felt it was important that we considered the current landscape, the future landscape, together as a profession in Sheffield, and had a conversation about how we shape and influence that future ourselves. So by way of introduction this evening, I just wanted to give a bit of context. We've got really good quality general practice in Sheffield, certainly relative to lots of other places. We do really well. Compared to other places, we do better from a workforce point of view, for example, recruitment and retention, whilst a strain is not as bad as other places. And yet we all recognise the pressures. We all recognise how hard it's been. And it's not just COVID related. You know, this has been mounting pressure for a number of years. And in fact, primary care is probably the only part of the NHS that's demonstrated a full recovery back to pre-pandemic levels. In fact, actually over pre-pandemic levels. If you look at the figures, it would suggest our workload now is 16% higher than it was back in 2015, and that's with fewer full-time equivalent GPs. So there's no wonder that we're all feeling under the cosh and under strain. We're seeing increased demand due to overspill from hospitals, who themselves are overwhelmed. Something like an increase of 87% in terms of rejected referrals from secondary care, apparently. I'm sure due to them trying to manage their burgeoning elective waits. 10 years of austerity means that we see increased pressure due to poverty, due to worsening inequalities, you know, the knock-on impact of underfunding of other public sector services, not least social care. All of that impinges on general practice. Clearly, the wider determinants of health are really complex. You only have to look back at the Wellness Report as far back as 2003 or Michael Marmot's work to understand the importance of investing in communities, of empowering individuals, empowering communities, and really thinking about ill health prevention or health creation, I think, is the new language for that. But shifting that locus of control, away from a very medicalized, paternalistic model of care towards something that's more person-centered out in communities. And I think as a system, despite that, we still see that all the power and lots of the resource gets sucked towards secondary care, towards specialist care, towards hospitals. And as general practices, I think we're caught in this constant state of tension, pulled between at one end of the spectrum, the nice guided, evidence-based, specialist dictated medical model, and at the other end of the spectrum, something that's more psychosocial and person-centered in nature. And perhaps our value as a profession is somewhere in that middle ground, occupying the space between the two extremes. And I think sometimes that value gets eroded or is certainly under-recognised unless certainly we shout about it and talk about it. And again, tonight's an opportunity for us to do that to a degree and demonstrate to the wider system the value that we are add. When Primary Care Sheffield was established back in 2014, it was to protect practices against private providers like Virgin and Sainsbury's and Assura, who were starting to dip into toe into the sort of general practice world, or alternatively to avoid being subsumed by the big acute trust in a PACS model. And it feels like 10 years on almost, the threats are slightly different. They're subtly different. It's about the very financial sustainability of our practices is at risk. Demand outstrips capacity. Workforce, is a real strain to recruit and to retain. And even the very model of the independent contract appears to be under threat, with both political parties really talking about the future of the partnership model and casting uncertainty on it, which just creates anxiety, frustration, and even anger in those of us that really value being partners. So whilst there's a subtly different reason for it, I think there's still very clear reasons why we need to work collectively to shape our futures. So the 3 workshops were a starting point, and Ollie will talk about the things we discussed there in a moment, and tonight we can hopefully build on some of that. What I would say is that I think we are in a really strong position in Sheffield. I think we're in a really good place. We're looked upon by other parts of the country as a beacon of success. I think others look to emulate what we've got in Sheffield. We're recognised by NHS England colleagues nationally and by policymakers as a primary care community that's forward thinking, that's seeking to innovate and doing some really good stuff. And that's why the likes of Labour's Wes Streeting and Claire Fuller and Matthew Taylor from NHS Confed, why they all want to come and visit and see what we're doing firsthand in Sheffield. It's why we win awards. PCS last year, the HSJ Primary and Community Provider of the Year. It's because people look on us positively, and I think we should all be really collectively proud of things like that. It's external validation that we're on the right track, and that through our layers of scale approach, we can really achieve high quality primary care in the city. We can be responsive and resilient and meet the needs of the Sheffield population. So last thing for me really would be a few questions perhaps for you all to consider as we go through this evening. Questions like, how do we use what we've currently got to create a sort of maximum efficiency, to reduce duplication, and to allow each component of general practice across those layers to really play to its strengths, to reach its potential, to bring its A game. If we're going to think creatively, if we were to sort of think innovatively, how could we make our own working lives easier and at the same time improve patient experience and their care by working more smartly and working differently? What about how we make collective decisions? What's the governance that we need to underpin collective decision making so that we can speak with one voice? The LNC has its constitution and an elected committee. PCS has its articles of association and an elected board from the localities. how as providers can we use these as a collective way to bring a voice to influence the wider system, particularly around resource shift. I think when we do speak as one, we're a really powerful force, but too often we don't, and we undermine each other by fighting over the scraps from secondary care's table. So how do we overcome some of that? And then finally, how might we engage patients in the discussion? Because at the end of the day, the reason why we're all here on an evening having this conversation when we could be with our families is because we care deeply about what we do for patients. So I'll pass over to Ollie, who's going to give us a bit of an overview of what we did through the workshops.
Thanks very much, Andy. Just give me a thumbs up. Can you hear me okay? Ben and Shrewbird, Andy, just so I can see you there. Great, thanks. Lovely, thank you. And I happen to be the one presenting these slides. It could have been any one of the 50 people that came to all three sessions. I think across the three, there was close to 80, 90 people that came. I think I've got the job because in 15 minutes, it suggested I could perhaps get through some of the huge volume of stuff that came out of those three sessions and to stimulate a little bit of discussion. But, you know, I certainly admire the fact that people are giving up time and that people are brave enough and to some degree resilient enough to actually look to the future and to consider what could be better. It really takes a lot of energy at the moment. So thank you for that. So the background to the work, I think, was that people felt we were starting to lose our identity as primary care in the system. And as a result, we're underinvested in and we're finding it hard to retain staff, which is never going to be good for laying foundation to the future. Along that, you know, there's £1 billion spent on health and wellbeing in Sheffield. So how much of that should be drawn into primary care and what we can do? Sorry, is that okay? Someone? No. And we wanted to ask ourselves, what can general practice in Sheffield deliver better than any other body or organisation in the city? Where could we add real value? Next slide, thanks. Oh, lovely, thank you. So we had 3 sessions, and this was just an overview of what we did. So session 1 was around just sort of exploring the risks, the issues and the barriers. And we really delved down into what we felt were the value and benefits of general practice to the whole health of the population. And we proposed 3 areas that we might sort of consider as areas where we could start. We've got to focus somewhere. Session 2 was around discussing those 3 focal areas and see if they made sense to us, and really trying to get feedback as well from a wider group of people. We'd set people the homework, if you like, really to sort of like converse and test with wider colleagues. So it wasn't just the people in the room, you're bringing other views in. And session 3 was, again, a sort of review, where are we up to? And then to try and start to identify potential changes for general practice and the wider system partners. What do we ask of them? And identify some key areas and next steps. So I'll highlight some of those. So next slide, thanks. So first, some initial general points that people made, and it's worth me stressing here, these are not my slides. These are slides that have been run by the whole group. It was tested throughout the 3 workshops, and it's been the kind of accumulated views of pretty much everybody that was involved, really. But what we sort of realize is that demand is really outstripping capacity at the moment, and many of us have insufficient time to do the job that we really want to do well. There's inadequate resources being put into primary care, whether that's finance, workforce, IT, and particularly estates. We're all struggling, aren't we? And as a result, we're seeing it's worsening inequalities and lowering morale. And I guess there was a really strong sense in the room that we could offer better for our patients. We would want to do a better job. Next, thank you. More general points, there's loads that we value. We all still felt that, general practice is a really worthwhile profession, and that it does fulfill a need that really needs doing. General practice is absolutely needed in the modern world. Working in a team, around a common purpose was something that we all really value as a team GP in Sheffield. And the opportunity to innovate and improve our care is something that really drives us. And there was a sense of what we're doing for the next generation. It's not just about us, it's what we're passing on. And what do we do well? Well, we're really good with continuity and complexity and managing risk. We do holistic care better than anybody else. The relationship-based medicine is what primary care is built on. And there's a great standard of general practice in Sheffield with a really good infrastructure. We've got a great set of PCNs and PCS and, a history of localities and some fantastic relationships and quality in the city. And we do already work collaboratively in various areas. Recent home visiting service is a great example where we shared that together. And what we did over COVID, fantastic. Next slide, thanks. But there were also some challenges as well. There's clearly for all of us attention if we're, thinking about working together and collaboratively between how much autonomy we want in our own individual work or as practices versus what we benefit from working together. And there's always a tension in that, isn't there? That trade-off, if you like, really. There's a need to widen our workforce and have broader professional roles. It's starting with the additional roles, but there's a whole load of people to bring in that perhaps haven't had a leadership say at the table amongst GP partners. And clearly we need to engage patients as well, and to some degree manage their expectation. It's all right well politicians to make promises, but are there promises that we are able to deliver on safely? We often work in isolation, and to some degree that's up to us to reach out and engage wider stakeholders. And we could make much better use of data, that track things. There's great tools out there. But the bottom line, of course, of none of this is easy at all. If it was, we would have done it by now. Thank you. Next slide, thanks. So those three broad areas that we wanted to put on the table, it's really hard sometimes, isn't it, to think, where do we start with this? So we tested out three areas, and we thought that these were the three areas that perhaps general practice really does better than anywhere else. So that timely access for relatively simple problems where we can, as general practice, we can churn through a huge volume of concerns from the public, can't we? The next was kind of like those less complicated long-term conditions. Perhaps you could say early phases where there's perhaps single conditions or just a few, and perhaps younger, less complicated people. And then the third was complicated, really complicated case management, end of life, those sorts of things. So I'll dive down to those and tell you what people came up with from those three areas. Thanks. Next slide. So timely access, getting into the system. So some of the things that came out. So, managing this acute demand, could we outsource it or collaborate in a different way to allow us space to focus on those other longer term conditions? Can we make more use of digital solutions and interoperability of primary care in Sheffield? Is there more opportunity to work collaboratively? The extended access and the visiting services that we've already started to do, could we deepen that? Could we make more of signposting and care navigation? I know lots of practices are thinking about that, and how do we make sure that that goes beyond just literally, giving a list of a menu to people, but actually involves educating patients and engaging them in participation, a more person-centered way. And that with that move to support self-management, so patients become an asset to us rather than always being a drain. There was a thought that, within this, we've got to trust each other. We are primary care together, and we're stronger together if we can build trust. That's always challenging for all of us. And can we utilize the whole team better to do these things? Can we use HCAs and ACPs and nurses and first contact physios as this sort of frontline, this multidisciplinary frontline team? And of course, there's a warning with this as well that we all know as experienced kind of like generalists, isn't it? That people don't always present neatly. So we need some safety netting in there that makes sure we catch people that might fall through the cracks if we just make it very rigid. Thank you. Next slide, please. So what this early phase management, this sort of partnership approach, you're sitting alongside people whilst they're driving, aren't you? Perhaps in this sort of situation, people are prepared to wait a little bit longer and have continuity of care, but that continuity might be delivered by a wider MDT. You might not need to have continuity with a GP. It might be with another member of the team. And this concept that actually we can be really good at building patients as experts, developing the peer support and group consultations, and to some degree demedicalizing. As Andy says, we're really good in primary care. It's sitting between the experts, highly sophisticated kind of medical model, and the communities. And within that, then there's the importance of us really tapping into the cultural and social differences and that kind of knowledge we have of our communities that we work with. Can we use a coaching culture to empower and activate people? That sort of mindset, we're good at that as well. We do use a lot of those skills already. And can we use the kind of digital sources we've got for coding and case finding and registers to kind of, again, to really manage this group of people really well and add value to the system, and move to this, this holy grail, isn't it, of getting upstream and actually trying to prevent things before they happen. Something that, always everyone calls for, but it's actually quite difficult to deliver. And we can do that and add real value to the system. Next slide, thanks. And then there's the complex case management. Again, perhaps, Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal, kind of deals with this, isn't it? We're all going to die, and actually, helping people to do that in a dignified and person-centered way is again a wonderful offer to the system. But also, it saves money. So if you do it well. So there's this thing here about this is where you really need good continuity of care, and relationships are crucial. Again, a whole team doing this sort of thing, and there's a real focus on people living well rather than just keeping people alive longer and longer. As well, we don't want to create dependency though, and we do want to build this patient education bit. So again, there was a really good sense around the skills that we could offer in this area. Thank you. Next slide. So that, again, came out of the sessions, this kind of feeling, are we reaching a bit of a tipping point where the kind of relentless front door pressure to actually deliver just firefighting, fast reactive care, is that distracting us away from being able to deliver this continuity and relationship-based care? And I guess there was also a reflection that, probably we're going to have to do both. They are the two sides of the coin of general practice. And again, who's better and more skilled to be able to build a resilient infrastructure than general practice? So this is a tough time, but we're the people perhaps to rise up to that challenge. And it was recognized in the fullest stock take, isn't it? This is a function of general practice. Thank you. Next slide. I'm sort of presenting these things as kind of thought-provoking, really, rather than necessarily answers, but this is what the workforce produced. So there were some strong action themes came out of the groups. What do we think we ought to do? Well, there was a strong theme around we should collaborate. We are stronger together. We need to be team primary care in Sheffield. People felt we need to build multidisciplinary teams with wider professional roles working together, and a real focus on drawing in wider stakeholders that we can kind of be the glue for. Perhaps that involves sharing estates, perhaps with the voluntary sector and community buildings to enhance, or it maybe involves us campaigning for more medical estates. It's probably a bit of each. And there's this kind of feeling of needing to upskill the workforce in a sort of wider diversity. So, the care navigation skills, can we get receptionists, maybe even expert patients? Can we get HCAs doing this sort of thing? How do we build, personalized, person-centered care into our workforce generically, and how do we ensure that people have got really good career development in primary care, so it's an attractive place to be? And of course, everyone talks about public engagement, but how do we get that so it's genuine participation and people are a real part of our team? And the bottom line is, that we want to show this collective value as a system in Sheffield, because that will give confidence to people to invest in us, and things improve for us all. Thank you. Next one. So that from this, that there is clearly a challenge to commissioners. I know there's a few commissioners on the call here, and I guess the question to you is, what do you need from us to enable you to fund services based in primary care? What do you need to give you confidence? Tell us what you need, so that we can ensure that resource is able to be taken from secondary care, where perhaps it's been overinvested, into primary care, where we know we can give real good value. So tell us what you need to build that confidence, and do try and avoid contracts that pitch people against each other. So we're competing for patients and for small pots of a budget. Like how can the commissioners create contracts that join us together and encourage collaboration, give us incentives to work together? Next one, thank you. Don't worry, I'm not going to read through all these, but just to illustrate, there was loads of redesign thoughts. We're not short on kind of ideas, and once people put their heads to it, there's some fantastic thoughts on the table. So loads and loads came out of those sessions. I just wanted to there's a few things down there. I'm not going to read through them all, but you can spot a few of the things there. And that was just a few picked out. There's loads, really. There's loads of energy behind this. Next one, thanks. So the further steps that came out of, just 3 sessions, you can't change the world in 3 sessions, can you? Of course, but there was a sort of a sense that perhaps we need some working groups, some with a focus, some on sort of patient and public engagement, some around how do we enable that resource shift to happen? How do we build confidence so resource shift can happen into primary care? How do we ensure that we, attract contracts locally that enable transformation. There's some wriggle room locally, isn't there, around leses and sort of deses and so on. So how can we be involved in contracts that work for us? A group also thinking about workforce, optimizing that kind of wider leadership engagement, and building what we need to train people and hold them in. So we also said we were going to meet on the 21st of September. Here we are with wider colleagues. Fantastic. And we were going to commit to trying to having an ongoing dialogue as a collaborative professional community. So that's where we're up to. So hopefully that summarized that in 15 minutes.
Thanks very much, Ollie. So this is the first part of the evening where there's a chance for some interaction and some discussion. So you've heard the context, you've heard about the outputs of the workshop, and particularly around 3 different sort of patient cohorts. So thinking about patients that need timely access, early stages of long-term conditions, complex case management, and you've heard about these particular themes around patient public engagement, resource shift, contract transformation, and optimizing workforce. And then also this strong theme around continuity. With the discussion, we probably don't want to rehash all of the workshops that we've had, but it would be really useful to know what's kind of missing. So not, there's all sorts of lenses on primary care and different nuances, but what's really crucial and key that hasn't been mentioned so far? What things have we got really strong consensus on? They're things that just everyone agrees on, and there's no contention at all. And a thing that you've heard that you feel a really strong allergic reaction to, you think, that just doesn't sit with me. I couldn't. There's no way I could get behind that. And then just any other sort of reflections, I suppose, on what you've heard. So open it up now for discussion. This is tricky, Ollie, because you're normally the first one to put your hand up, but you've just presented, so we can't rely on you.
We can't. No. Is it easy to stop sharing the slides, Tom? Then we can see everyone's faces. That might remind people that you can use the chat box as well. If you're not the sort of auditory person that jumps in like me, use the chat box to get some of your thoughts down as well.
I mean, can I ask perhaps we've taken one by. I mean, one of the really sort of important questions is just: is there anything that you've heard that that really doesn't sit well? Because that's really important to know. If there's stuff there that you think, absolutely, I just cannot agree with that, Lee.
Yeah, just to kick us off, because I'm sure we've all got lots to say. I suppose, having been to the 3 meetings, thanks, Ollie. I think that was really well summarised, and I think I'm really. It's great that these meetings are happening. It's great that tonight's happening. So I'm being positive about it. I don't want this to come across as negative. But when you said the first thing that actually doesn't sit right, I suppose it's that, and maybe others feel it as well, that idea of sort of farming out the acute care stuff. I think that for me is quite a contentious thing, just because we all know that within that there's a lot of minefields. And I think we have to be really, really careful. And I'm just mindful of a conversation I had with St. John Livesey, who's looking at admissions. And he said he was looking at, and there was nobody else here from that conversation, so forgive me if I've got the figures wrong. But I think he said out of a cohort of patients that were admitted, there was something like only 1 out of 8 would have been admitted if they'd actually been seen by a GP. They didn't come via the GPs. And so it's the challenge that we've got, isn't it? How do we manage this sort of unmanageable workload in a rational way, but actually don't somehow make it worse as well? So I haven't got an answer to that, but I suppose that was just sort of one feeling. And the other thing I was thinking is the challenge in this of that sort of one size fits all, because we all serve very, very different populations, and they look very different. So the sort of stuff that Rob and I might see at Firth Park will be really different to the stuff that Rowan's seeing in Nether Edge, sorry, Rowan, I don't know where you work, Carchenol or wherever it is, but they're different populations, and so there's that sort of nuance bit in all of this while we're trying to get a consensus, which I absolutely support, and get a unified voice. it's managing that sort of nuance of how this works for all the populations that we serve.
Thanks, Lee. I think that's really helpful to hear. And I know Ben Allen giving a thumbs up. I know, Ben, you have sort of similar sort of thoughts around the access stuff. So it's worth just making, giving that some airtime, really. Anyone else? Any other kind of thoughts? I can see your comment in the chat, Kate, about happy to see more acute presentations in your practice, but you need more resource to do that. Absolutely, Joe.
Hi there. Hi. Thank you very much for your presentations. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to make the meetings in the summer. They coincided with some annual leave, so our practice struggled to get there. Is there an elephant in the room here that we've not mentioned, the partnership model, and what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about what are we? I struggle to articulate exactly how to frame this question, but I'm very aware that we're hearing from you, Tom, we're hearing from you, Ollie, for people who very much stepped away from your practices. And I'm looking around the attendees in this meeting and the people that are still very much sort of working within a small team, supporting the small teams that actually deliver this the continuity, the care that you talk about. And I just want to put it out there. But I'm not quite sure within what frame this conversation sits. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're working in a different way to the way that you describe. And are we describing a mechanism to get from where the practices are to sort of what we see nationally? Are we, what are we trying to, how, it's, to me, what you've said raises more questions than it gives us answers, but I'm aware that I haven't been at the workshops. So sorry, that's a partly formed question.
I'm happy to answer that, Tom, if you want. Or try.
Yeah, I mean, before you jump in, Andy, I mean, I'm not going to try and answer that question because I can't, Joe, I don't think. And I'm certainly, if I did, it would be a personal opinion, really. So I can't answer it. But yeah, Andy, why don't you, if you're keen to.
Well, all I was going to add to that, I mean, I think it's a really healthy thing, and I don't think it should be an elephant in the room. I think it should be something that we talk about openly. And I make no bones about the fact that I really value being a partner in a practice, and I'm also a member of a PCN, and I'm also part of PCS, and I recognise that actually there's advantages of all of those layers of scale. And I would go back to the reason why PCS was set up, which was to protect the partnership model and to protect the practices and allow them to do what they can do best. So I think we have to approach the conversation around the partnerships and practices openly and build trust. None of us can control what happens nationally in terms of policy and politics, and we know that both political parties have talked about the partnership model in the national press, and it creates a huge amount of tension and anxiety. And if I speak completely openly, I think PCS has borne the brunt of some of that. And I speak to Fed colleagues across the country, and they have, because anything that stands for something that might be slightly different to the traditional partnership model potentially then feels like a threat to those of us that are partners. But I can assure you, as Chief Executive of PCS and as a partner, that the reason why PCS does what it does is to try and protect and support practices so that they can do the best that they can do. But I'd also come back to Lee's point about the acute stuff. I think the people that are admittedly are probably complex rather than necessarily simple. And I see lots of people in the hubs who value being seen in a hub and don't need to see their own GP or their own practice. And I don't think there's enough of us to do all of it all of the time. So whilst we would love to be able to do everything in individual practices, maybe we could find a way of trusting each other, using the economies of scale, and all playing to our strengths so that those that need continuity most get it most of the time. Those that don't need it don't get it, but there's a safety net that if it turns out that what was thought to be simple isn't, we can plug them back into their registered GP for continuity on an ongoing basis. And I think that's the sort of conversation we need to be having in these sorts of sessions. But I really value Joe bringing it up, because if we don't talk about it, it remains an elephant in the room, and it shouldn't.
Thanks, Andy. Tom?
Yeah, I want to highlight, I think, that the sessions that we went to, we celebrated the different models of general practice, even within Sheffield. And one thing that was very valuable feeding into the discussions that we had was the mix of partners and non-partners. We had some sessional doctors, some locoming doctors with us, as well as non-doctor colleagues who all form the core members now of the general practice team. So I think I really just wanted to share that and highlight to those who weren't at those meetings. One of the really good things about those meetings is it was not just the usual faces that you saw. Many of them still were there, but there was a much broader spectrum of general practice within Sheffield that fed into these conversations.
Thanks, Tom. That's great to hear. Nikki or Claire, is it? Who's got hand up next?
Yeah, it's Nikki. Sorry, just sharing the same laptop. So yeah, it's Nikki. So I just want to go back to Joe's comments, if that's okay. And I'm on this, well, I suppose I'm on this meeting tonight as a practice manager rather than a locality manager. So I know we all have various sort of roles in primary care, but these comments as a practice manager, just going back to what Joe said, it does feel like we are probably 3 or 4 steps in front of where we should be at this meeting. And that's not to downplay what we've done. I think this is really positive. I think it's really positive we've got all these people here talking about what we're trying to do as a wider system. But as a locality manager speaking to practices, and as a locality manager speaking to the other locality managers who are linked in with their practices, the majority of practices in Sheffield, which I assume is replicated across the country at the minute, are struggling to provide day-to-day services. They are struggling to meet their financial commitments. They're struggling to retain staff. It is as hard out there as it has ever been, I would say, if not worse. We get less money. We get the least amount of money invested in us through the system for the part of the system that delivers sort of most activity. It feels like the voices and the needs of the individual practices are being ignored for this lovely vision of integration and working with all these different various services and things, which is fantastic for patients. But the individual practices are the building blocks for everything that we want to do. Without the individual practices being strong financially, being able to retain staff, having the correct premises, everything that goes with being a good individual practice, without that, the PCNs fail, the goals of the ICB fail, the patients will fail, they will fall onto the rest of the system. And it feels like we are moving forward. So everything is PCN centric. If it's not PCN centric, it's citywide focus. We had a lot of conversation about citywide delivery on behalf of practices. If we do not support the practices and find a way to put something in place for the practices, we will not have the PCNs because there's no headspace to do it. There's no funding to do it. People are just living day to day to try and survive. And talking to practices, they feel at the moment that they are not being listened to as individual practices. If we ignore that and fail the individual practices as an organisation or organisations, everything else will fail, in my opinion. That's my opinion as a practice manager and not as a locality manager.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nikki. I mean, I think I'm going to slightly respond to that. I think it's really important to hear that stuff, because in my mind, some of that potentially feeds into what are the rules of engagement about how we work together. Because those fears are just absolutely vital. Those fears, those worries, those concerns. We need to get them out. We need to be aware of them. We need to hear them. Maria.
Hi. Yes, I agree with everything that's been said. But for me, the most important thing is to keep our staff. The problem is, we can talk forever about what we should be doing and how we should be seeing all the patients ourselves and not for hiving off the acute stuff. But the demand is so enormous. And for people now, everything is a priority, it's an emergency. You know, the verruca is just as important as the cancer symptoms. And it's overwhelming for young staff, for new starters, for new GPs coming in, and also for all the, you know, the other staff that we have, such as PAs and so on, because they all need support. You cannot have PAs, ANPs, and so on working in a practice without support from a GP. As the GPs are getting thinner on the ground, that support is more and more difficult. And I think, you know, we have to be pragmatic about this. If we're going to save general practice and save these young people that are coming out of training with very high standards, you know, if we're going to retain them and get them working in general practice, we have to make it easier for the important things to be done, you know, not the things which we could possibly hive off. I mean, I know what Lee was saying. I completely agree with her fundamentally, but in the current climate, if we could hive off some of the emergency stuff, the same day stuff, if it could be done, I know, you know, we talked about potentially having one service across the city, sort of admin service across the city, but I'm not in favour of that. I think then you lose the local sensitivity and the differences within primary care networks. But if you could have, for instance, an acute service within a primary care network, then there would be that local sensitivity. It would be easier to pass people back if they were needing more continuity, but it would give us time to manage the continuity of care, the complexity, and do it properly, not rushing through everything in 10-minute appointments. It's completely impractical. And, you know, if we lose the staff, if we cannot retain them, then where are we going to be? You know, you can put in as many ancillary staff of different professions, but if they haven't got that teamwork around them, if they haven't got experienced GPs who love what they're doing and who are favouring continuity to help and support them, then we're lost. And I also agree with what Nikki's saying. The financial situation is dire. And unless we speak to the centre, unless we get some kind of sensitivity and understanding from above, then we really are scuppered.
Thanks, Maria. David?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, being LMC secretary, I have to support most of what Nikki said. The bottom line is that the building blocks of general practice are the individual GPs and the individual practices, and I think the focus has rather been diverted to networks and network working. Networks won't work without individual practices, so I think that is a focus the ICB needs to concentrate on. I think there's also the ICB should be resisting the shift of work from secondary care into primary care, and should be trying to move funding out of secondary care, but with realistic workload asked of general practice in the current workload crisis. And again, as was mentioned earlier, the estates, the premises in Sheffield are dire. They're dire for individual practices, let alone for networks.
Thanks,
Thank you.
David. Thanks. Rob?
Hi, yeah, a few meandering points. And actually, I think my thunder on a couple of them have been partly stolen by the chat, which hopefully says some of what I was about to say. Is the big challenge we've got. I mean, first question is, I'm really glad that we're all gathering and just talking and sharing, because I think it's really important that we have a unified voice and we all agree that things are difficult. There may not be an easy answer, but at least we're talking. That's really important. The challenge you've got, quite obviously, is that resources have gone down and demand has gone up. And the slight a big worry is if we're going to create a new service for anything, and I know Emma Latimer's here, are there any more resources coming into the system? Because I think the answer is no. So if we're going to do anything, then those resources are going to be taken away from what we currently have. And that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, does it? Because who's going to be prepared to hand over thousands of pounds of their own income for some service which may be disproportionately used by other surgeries to subsidise their daycare? That's not going to happen. So we have to allow practices to manage their own population. I'm the best person to deal with my own patients because I know them. And when they say stuff, I've heard it before, and sometimes it's important, sometimes it really isn't. But if you don't know your patients and they say, oh, my chest hurts, and I go, well, I've heard that for the last 15 years. You're probably not dying today, but you can bet your bottom dollar an ACP won't think that. and they'll be doing troponins before you know it. So I think we need to allow practices to manage their own patients. There might be an economy of scale for very small practices to work within an area together, because I do think there is a sort of minimum size that works. But so the question really I have is, it's about, if there's no more resources coming in, then it's about enabling practices to reduce the demand. And what David just said, so he stole my thunder as well, was we need to be better at saying, no, we can't do that as well as everything else we're doing, and we won't do this. And we're quite clear about certain things that we can no longer do, but that are reasonable to no longer do. And we pass them on to somebody else, like a pharmacy service, and just say, we don't do verrucas or whatever, don't talk to us about verrucas. Or am I wrong and there is some extra resource, in which case let's have a nice meeting about how we're going to spend it.
Thanks, Rob. Helen?
Thank you. Yeah, it's not a surprise what I'm going to say. Probably is that you need different services in areas of deprivation, don't you? And if you try and cream stuff off, even at a PCN level, patients just won't go because they won't have transport to get to hubs, and they want to be seen in their own general practice, so they'll probably wait, a lot of them, and there's more patients that are vulnerable in areas of deprivation. So you've immediately got a population that needs something different. I know Lee was sort of saying this, but you can't, it's another elephant in the room, isn't it? You can't get away from the fact that those patients are going to have more crises, that there's just going to be more of them wanting urgent care, basically, and not able to access it from those hubs because of the complexity that their urgent care comes with. It's part of their chronic illness. You could have somebody who's, it is their 5th infection that year. They probably have got COPD, but if they keep going to, even if they go to the hubs, it probably won't get picked up and addressed like it would if it was seen in general practice. So I think that we just need to have different systems in different areas, don't we? And it's likely, but it's what frustrates me is that hubs will probably work in more affluent areas, so they'll get more again, won't they? How do we cope with that challenge, really?
Thanks, Helen. I was thinking I might summarize where I think we're up to and just see whether that stimulates any more sort of thoughts. We've got another few minutes if people have got other thoughts. So far, I think I've heard various people talk about the idea of segmenting urgent same-day demand and worries about that, and whether it's the right thing to do or whether it might create problems. Some particular worries about the elephant in the room, about the independent contract. What does all of this mean for the independent contract? Some stuff about actually valuing diversity of thought, that having had quite a wide variety of people in the workshops is a good thing. Particular worries about ignoring the voices of practices, that none of this works if practices are not sustainable. Worries about staff retention. Concerns and worries about managing transfer of work when there isn't funding or resources that flow with it, and concerns and worries about what does inequality and deprivation do to sort of plans when you're trying to plan something at a big scale, and that actually things need to work differently in different parts of the city. Be great if anyone could sort of suggest if I've missed anything key there, or whether that sort of stimulates any other kind of thoughts. Okay, we'll give it another short while if anyone's got anything else to say, or perhaps we can move on. Ben.
Yeah, not quite sure how to articulate this, but I guess there's one dynamic that I've seen is you've got NHS England who want to be able to have some kind of an impact, so in if you're dealing with a hospital, there's just like a handful of people, and it's easy for them to have that conversation and to get something in particular done. And I get the sense that primary care just seems like this massive, so many organizations, that thing about we all want to be heard, we all want to have a relationship, we all want to be heard, but it's just this real complicated, but so many practices. And I think there's perhaps some kind of decision to be made between us about do we accept that this is something that NHS England want to be able to engage with primary care and be able to get certain things done through us, and I mean that might end up getting done to us anyway. So do we decide, okay, actually we're going to give up a certain amount of autonomy to be able to let that happen, or do we, and this is probably my preference, is I think that, and this is from what I'm hearing, is that we really value the way that our practices are unique. They fit the local populations. They're all different, and that kind of small is beautiful idea, and really push hard to make, we're a big city, like we're a lot of, we're a big part of the workforce, and with a voice, and we could push back and say, I know that you want to be able to get some things done simply with some kind of simple relationship, but actually the uniqueness of our practices and the autonomy and what we do with it, it's just that is more important. And so I know whether there's some kind of decision to be made about whether or not we push back on that kind of idea that we kind of need to be an easier bunch to be able to kind of just all do the same thing, basically, or work out what are the things that we're happy to all do together, and what are the things that we want to have our local independence about. So I probably not explain that very well.
I think it's a really sort of key challenge there, Ben. Tom.
Yeah, just want to really, I think, again, build on that, but also evidence it. When I put my clinical director hat on, and if you look at the capacity and access part of the PCN network work that we're doing at the moment, this has been shoehorned into a PCN contract. But if we're honest, this is a practice level issue, and what it to me highlights is that they've chosen an easy road. There's fewer networks to have to contact, to have to manage. It's an easier contract to change, or whatever it was. I don't know, but it was misplaced. It was misplaced, and I think just to highlight your point there, Ben, I think further.
Thank you, Tom. So we're rapidly running out, or we're coming to the end of this half an hour slot. So I've also got added to my list the importance of the uniqueness of practices is potentially important to people. I think perhaps there's also something interesting here about, in some of the discussion, we're sort of surfacing potentially, recognition that there are different layers of scale that are useful and do different things, but equally potentially there are times when there is a tension between those layers and perhaps what is best done at what scale. And again, that might be something to discuss later about how are we going to resolve those tensions, because we might as well recognize that they're clearly real. Lee.
Yeah, and again, I'm not sure if this is helpful or not, but there's a danger, isn't there, that we'll get caught up on, well, actually, we're going to sort out acute care tonight, and you can get into those arguments. Well, actually, the bigger conversation is actually, how do we, as a group of GPs and primary care representatives in Sheffield, bring together our voice and get that consensus as well? Do you know, I think we don't want to be trying to solve every problem, which we do as GPs, don't we? Actually, the bigger discussion in this, I think, is the bringing together of all these voices and how we actually work through everybody's differences, and but actually make our voice heard rather than trying to solve individual issues at the moment.
Thank you, Lee. I'm almost tempted to draw it nicely to close there, but that's we've got another minute. Anyone else got? But I absolutely agree. Anyone got any other things to say? Anna.
You have to excuse me, I'm off with COVID at the moment, so I'm struggling a little bit. I did write in the chat, and there's been quite a lot of chat in the chat about the fact that we're approaching this from a really medical model still at the moment, and so much of primary care now is not ill health in the traditional sense, and I think we need to be careful that we don't continue to view it just from a medical lens. We've got all the new roles, and we've got all the additional things. Anyway, my brain's really fuddled, so I'll stop there, but there's lots in the chat about it. I think we need to make sure that we don't just continue to look at it through a medical lens.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks. That's great. Good, a well-made point. Shall we move on now? We had half an hour for discussion. Then there will be more time for further discussion once we've heard some other perspectives.
Is it over to me then, Tom? Is that next?
I think that's right. I haven't got the agenda in front of me, Alistair, but sorry.
Yeah, no,
I think that's right. Over to you, I think.
Have we got some slides? Fantastic. Next slide, if we're... That's great, thanks. So, hi, I'm Alistair Bradley. I'm chair of Sheffield Local Medical Committee and a GP in Hillsborough. And I'm probably just going to put some flesh on the bones of some of the discussions we've had, and hopefully at the end of it, just crystallise perhaps with the commissioners here some of the requests, not necessarily an extensive list, but some of the requests, and I think it sort of reflects some of the discussion that we've had. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just to put a little bit of background. We've discussed about the pressures that general practice are under, and this is just a reflection of some of those issues. We're providing 1.33 million appointments a month. This is sort of far more than we were during the pandemic. We're actually doing this with a reduced budget. We now primary care receives 8% of the NHS budget spend. We are doing this with fewer fully qualified GPs, and we see a sort of rising workload in terms of number of patients that GPs are looking after. And what this is tending to do is to create a huge sort of stressful environment for us working in general practice and primary care. This leads on to workforce dissatisfaction. And we can see that a number of practices nationally are looking at handing the contract back. But the other thing that this really can create as well is what's described as moral injury. And this is where actually the stresses, the pressure of the system on us is so great that actually it starts to create ill health in the workforce as well. So moral injury is a very serious consequence of the workload stressful environment pressures we're under. Next slide, please. This is just to give a sort of very brief summary of the contract sort of negotiations. So obviously we're all aware that there's the end of the 5-year deal, sort of the end of March 2024, and that includes the end of the PCN DES, and we've had lots of questions about what's coming next. Given the political climate, the Treasury have really only funded a 1-year deal from April next year. So any long-term deal will have to wait until 2025. So it's a bit of a stopgap. But there have been comments from NHS England about the fact that the funding will roll over from the 1st of April for the ARS roles. And NHS England is committed to PCNs continuing. I just note there that because it's an important note for later, some of the PCN work, things like the Enhanced Health in Care Homes package, there's been a lot of unhappiness we've heard from networks and clinical directors and people dealing with this. And I think there are some very valuable learning lessons for this sort of looking forward when we come to talk about neighbourhoods. And that's about the services that sort of wrap around to support what general practice does in some of these environments. So I'll come back to that point later. Next slide, please. So just rattling through some of the issues, obviously, workload issues, we're very aware that There is a huge increased burden of workload on practices and networks. 2019 was the inception of the PCNDES, and we were told that the ARS roles would be there to support practices in delivering the excessive activity that was being asked of us in 2019. Well, that activity, has increased significantly since the pandemic. A lot of this workload comes from secondary care, and I didn't actually add advice and guidance on there, but given NHS England's statement yesterday, we can add advice and guidance as another secondary care workload issue for us. We have sort of shared care protocols, locally commissioned services, traffic light drug list systems that constantly tend to be pushing work from secondary care into primary care, and this is unfunded. Bureaucracy, again, we briefly touched on the access plans for networks, and the amount of workload bureaucracy that is increasing day on day. We've got obviously sort of supervision of a lot of those ARS roles. And we've also got this sort of ticking time bomb that we've been told that the Sheffield population is set to increase by 70,000 by the year 2030. So that is a huge, sort of increase in population, and actually the need for more GPs and more ARS roles and more other staff than we actually have at the moment. So we need to plan for that. Next slide, please. So the workforce plan has been announced, and I do apologise that this is very medical, but it's just to highlight some of the suggestions in the workforce plan to try and improve our lot in general practice. So obviously doubling medical school places, increasing the number of foundation places for those junior doctors, more all foundation doctors to spend some time in general practice, increase in general practice speciality training from, well, it's been increased to 4,000 at the moment, and the plan is to increase that to 6,000, and GP trainees to spend a full 3 years in general practice, with also the inclusion of these specialist and associate specialist doctors as part of the workforce. So again, a lot of impressive looking numbers, but the devil is in the detail. You can increase medical school places, it's going to cost, but how do you convince these people that general practice is the right place to work? And I come back to the first slide where we talked about stressful environment, workforce dissatisfaction, and moral injury. So we can't just do it by the numbers game alone. In terms of the training in that, well, we need more time to supervise, we need more trainers, we need more training program directors to do this. We're going to need more GP time to supervise, and we're going to need more premises to host all these GP trainees as well. The SAS doctors as well really don't help us out because, for two reasons. One, they have no interest in working in general practice. We had a conference meeting earlier this year, and the SAS doctor representative said, we don't want to do this. And the general practitioner said, we don't want you in general practice. And so this is an NHS England suggestion. SAS doctors are not able to work with undifferentiated presentation of health. So they would not be able to work unsupervised in general practice. So if we had SAS doctors in general practice, they would also need to be supervised. Next slide, please. So I think we've done a lot of this about the sort of the premises and actually all the other things that we need. Next slide, please. So premises themselves, I think as David pointed out, we do have a big issue with the sort of the estate in the city. We've got 3 new hubs being established in the north of the city and the proposed next centre in the city centre. But we come back to this issue of how do we accommodate the expanded workforce we've got, and suggestions of expanding training further. External organisations. We had a presentation from the mental health transformation team last week at our committee. They want to come and use our premises as well. You know, I've put IAP, sorry, that should be talking therapies. You know, talking therapies want to come and use our premises. We all recognise the advantage of having these services closer to home, easier access for patients. They know the place, but we haven't got the space to we haven't got the space to accommodate them. And you know, added to the ARS roles, we're getting you know, sort of more administrative and management roles to cope with the increased bureaucracy that we're getting as well. Next slide. So this is a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it all, but this is just to, and this comes back to the discussion that we had earlier about the independent contractor model. So this is just some statements from some people sort of in power or influence recently about their view. And a lot of them are talking about, you know, general practice should be a salaried service, bringing it back into the NHS fold. You know, even Lord Darzai suggesting that actually we should be a totally preventative service and move away from a treatment service. And I just sort of point out that there's a lot of political pressure around this. There has always been a lot of political pressure around this. If I take any of you who can remember back to before the PCN days, we had something called the offer of the community provider contract. And this was where we were to give up our GMS contract and sign up to some community provider. And we all rejected that suggestion because at the time we all felt that the GP, the independent contractor model, not only served our purposes, but actually we felt served our patients' purposes much better than any other model. And whilst we do think about networks and neighbourhoods and engaging with other organisations to support our patients, I think as the BMA have pointed out at the bottom there, you know, an appropriately sourced independent contractor model provides far more benefits than any of these other ones. So in terms of these sorts of comments about salaried service, it's not something I would roll over and accept lightly. And I think it is something that I would certainly want to fight for, and something I'd sort of like to hear from the rest of you afterwards as well. Next slide. So this is just a sort of another sort of issue about the direction of travel with you know, sort of policy. So we've heard there's obviously a move to move a lot of care out to secondary care. And you know, this again, you know, we're all aware of the pressures. There's more talk now about sort of neighbourhoods rather than the network DARES, and we've heard absolutely correctly that the network DARES has become a sink for practice-based work. The IF, if you look at the requirements, they're all practice-based data collection, and the access plans are all about access to practices as well. We've mentioned about the dichotomies of acute versus chronic disease management, at scale versus practice-based management. But again, it's holding on to the things that we know work, and continuity of care is the one thing that benefits the patient, and it reduces admissions to hospital. It helps secondary care, it helps the system. It's something that we need to try and maintain. Next slide, please. So just a couple of slides really trying to crystallize some of the asks of the commissioners really. So this was some of the ICB primary care meetings that we've attended, and both myself, Andy and Tom Holdsworth attend these meetings. And there's a primary care plan being developed by the ICB. And I think we sort of all agreed that the things we want to see from a primary care plan is not just a shift of workload, but actually a shift of resources from secondary care to support and to fund that workload. Long-term funding arrangements, and that's so that we can actually plan and develop and expand our workforce rather than sort of very short-term funding arrangements that have come and gone. We talked about the prevention agenda, and you know, I don't think we should become an entirely prevention agenda service, but certainly prevention moving upstream is something that we can do in communities through neighbourhood working and support. So, but again, we need support in that as well. And again, I think as Nikki Normanton mentioned, you know, it's the practices, it's the building blocks, and it's actually engaging with them and working with the sort of people on the ground to say, actually, what's needed in your area, your network. It's different with health inequalities. So it's not a one size fits all. So it shouldn't be a top down model either. Next slide. And you'll be pleased to know this is the last slide, but again, it's just some of the workload or the work going on at the ICB just seems incongruous with supporting general practice. So, for example, there's been, you know, the ICB have instigated a review of locally commissioned services. They have 8 or 9 task working groups working on these things. And we've been told there's no more money, we're just reviewing them across the 4 patches. So 8 or 9 tasked and finished groups for this sort of work. This would be much better focused on, say, reducing bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is part of the contract for this year. I know there's been a lot of, you know, sort of focus on access, but actually managing the primary secondary care interface and reducing bureaucracy is a prime part of the contract this year. I don't see 8 task and finish groups working on that, but it's what makes our job better and what makes it more sustainable. So we need to understand, or we need to say to commissioners that actually, you know, it needs to be focused on things that will benefit us and our patients. The working life, you know, again, I come back to the issue of workforce dissatisfaction and moral injury. There's nothing in the workforce plans about GP retention. You know, in Sheffield, we fund 2 GP retainers for the whole of Sheffield, and there's nothing in the workforce plan about retention. If we don't make the job attractive, then people are not going to stay. I mentioned there, you know, what is again, for the commissioners, what is the plan for reducing bureaucracy? It's in the contract. And the last thing is, you know, we need a plan, and this is a long-term plan for considering the training demands increase and the population increase for general practice. So while it's not an exhaustive list, I hope it does at least add some questions and some requests to the commissioners that we do need to improve the working lot of general practice in Sheffield for us and for our patients. Thank you.
So is it straight over to me then now?
I think that's right, Emma. I think, yeah, over to you if that's okay.
So, hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emma Latimer. I'm the Place Director for Sheffield. I'm part of the NHS South Yorkshire Integrated Care Board. I joined about 14 months ago. Before that, I was the accountable officer of 3 CCGs in the Humber. One of them had the 3rd lowest GP head per population in the country. So believe me, I'm kind of well versed in issues in primary care. I suppose one thing I'd say about all of this, you know, it's like the commissioner is the enemy. You know, I joined Sheffield because I want the best care for patients. So to kind of be referred to as the commissioner all night feels a little bit interesting for me. It's not something that I'm kind of used to, because I see myself as part of a broader team. And I've got 2 main things that I focus on. One is improving the health of the population that I serve, and the second is making sure we retain a workforce that wants to be in Sheffield. So it's just a really interesting view, having never been to one of these meetings before, as though I'm some kind of enemy. We're actually not. We're here to support you and to ensure that we have the best possible care in the country, and that is my view. So I just thought it was an interesting observation. So in terms of Sheffield primary care, so what I would say is, coming to Sheffield, I feel like primary care is probably one of the best primary care services I've ever worked in. I think there's some fantastic GPs, some fantastic practices, and you know, it's been a kind of, it feels like a bit of a privilege to be surrounded by so many great people in primary care. And I want to say a massive thank you to people, because I think, as Nikki said, it's relentless, absolutely relentless in terms of what you've been dealing with, what you continue to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I don't underestimate that. I was going to talk to you a bit about the ICP, so the Health and Care Partnership Priorities, of which there are 5, but I think I'd rather spend my time really just talking about primary care, if that's okay, because I haven't got that long. But what I'd say is that primary care is a special case, absolutely is a special case, and I've always viewed it in that way, not in a negative way, but in the fact that, you know, big organisations have lots of infrastructure, they have a lot of support. Primary care doesn't. It has to survive, as you say, largely on the partnership model, and doesn't have that resource and capability that big organisations do. And so throughout my career in the NHS, I've always treated primary care in that respect, in terms of how much support we can possibly give you. So I was asked here really because I think I'd had some discussions earlier in the year with Zach, obviously his medical director, and some other colleagues just about our vision, our view of primary care Sheffield. So the way that things work at the moment is I'm given a, and in fact, you could take the slide down because I'd rather see people, that's okay, because I haven't got a slide set. So basically, I was asking, you know, what is the vision for primary care in Sheffield? Where does it exist? Because at the moment, I currently get the £1.2 billion that is, that's currently delegated to myself as the place director through a subcommittee and a partnership. And we need to make sure that that continues to happen, because the only way that we can start to do things differently is by ensuring that we keep that resource in place. Because if we're going to start to invest differently, and I've invested differently when I was in CCGs before, when we had the total money at place, we need to retain that total resource in Sheffield. If we do not, if we start to see that being hived off into collaboratives like the Acute Care Federation, the Mental Health Federation, that really does worry me, because then it starts to mean, you know, what does that mean for us? The money is place-based, and it's not just health. There's a lot of non-health money that comes into place that we need to be looking at to address the wider determinants of health, as other people have already said. But if I'm going to be able to go out and bat, and I have to go and bat for primary care, I need to ensure that I've got a vision that's built some consensus around. So I'm an absolute advocate of the partnership model. I think I'm really flexible about model of general practice. It doesn't matter as long as they work. They work for Sheffield, they work for you, they work for the staff that we're here to employ, and we're able to retain staff. So I'm not of this kind of mantra of we've got to end the partnership model. The partnership model is a fantastic model, as our other models. It doesn't matter, and I think we need a mixed economy. So I'm not in the case of trying to force people down one route or the other. But if we're going to have a primary care vision and strategy, then we need to have some consensus about what do we need to do to effectively move resource from your big provider organisations into primary, community and the voluntary sector. And I think that's what I'm really keen to hear. If I was going out to bat for primary care, which I absolutely need to do, then what am I going to bat with? You know, what's the consensus here? What do I need to do that's going to make a difference to your lives and your practice lives? So I think it's really important that we think about that. And also, you know, when we talk about investment in primary care, you know, we don't want to be doing it on a 12-month basis, because investment usually means workforce. And workforce, we need recurrent resource around workforce. We can't just have a 12-month contract for a bit of money here and a bit of money there. So that whole long-term view of how we're going to resource primary care, I think, is really important as we move forward. I mean, there are lots of opportunities around portfolio careers, influencing the federation. And I think, again, interesting, Alice, to what you talk about the South Yorkshire view. Again, how much has Sheffield got in that space, really? Because when you talk about something, I'm not quite. I've got some views on that in terms of what the South Yorkshire did, and there's always going to be this tension between place and South Yorkshire. And I think we probably need to do a bit more work around that. So in previous roles, you know, we've invested in things like frailty, and when I say invest in frailty, we've invested in the whole pathway. In an integrated care centre, into primary care. I've used LESs and put loads of resource into LESs to really make a difference, because I recognise that a small investment sometimes in primary care can make a huge difference. So I'm really interested in that. But I think what we need here, and what I was asking for, is, you know, what is our common purpose? We can't solve everything. Kind of sat here, listen to your reflections. There are loads of issues that need to be sorted in primary care, things that the ICB maybe have control over, some things that the place might have control over, some things that are absolutely not in our gift at the moment. But how do we lobby potentially a new government coming in into making sure that the priority is given to primary care that it needs. So, as I say, I'm not going to go over the ICB priorities and the certainly health and care partnership priorities. I just think it's really important that I get from you, what is it you want me to solve first? Because there are things that I can't solve. There are things that I might be able to solve. But if I'm going to go into bat for primary care, it'd be nice to have a consensus around, what are your absolute priorities and what do I really need to be focusing on first? Because some of the things that you listed there, Alistair, I'm not going to be able to solve those in the ICB, the Commissioner, NHS England. We need to be having some really, really robust debates with them about, how we start to change this. What I would say is that being the place director, Ian's on the call, he's the deputy place director. We want to be flexible. We want to be responsive. We want to try and make life easier for general practice. We want to invest in general practice, but we need to build consensus about what it is we're asking for. And I think that's the key for me. So coming here today really was to listen to what you've got to say, but some of the contractual issues aren't going to be solved by us. But what can we focus our energy on? What can we start to invest in? And how can I sort of support primary care in the agenda to make sure that resource really does go in there? We can invest in primary care in the future. Bearing in mind, I think what somebody else has said, the ICB is currently forecasting 120 million deficit this year. So money is really tight. It is really tight. But actually, we know if we invest money in some non-medical roles into primary and community care, we can deliver real efficiency, because care close to home is really important, as is continuity of care. So I'm not going to say any more at this moment in time, because I'm sure I'm going to get lots of questions to me, and I'm happy to take them obviously tonight, and if I can't answer them, I'll come back to you. So thank you for giving me 10 minutes of your time. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. So we've got about 20 minutes of discussion. So again, if you can put your hands up if you've got something you want to ask, it's a great opportunity to have Emma here. Again, I think it's useful to be able to put questions in the chat as well, because some people might find it a bit nervous to put their hand up and speak. But I also just want to, I want to kind of endorse what Emma said, because you'd expect her to talk up primary care when she's in the room with people full of primary care, but she does it when you're not in the room as well. It's been a consistent thing that she really believes in primary care. She's seen it be very effective in other places. She really does want to invest. I think the questions for us are, what are the priorities? What is our consensus? What are we, if we can get behind something tangible, I do think Emma's really keen to invest in primary care, and it's just a question of what those things are that we will all agree, yes, this is something we could all get behind. So I think, Alistair, I think you're first.
Thanks, and thanks for that, Emma. It doesn't have to all be about investment. So some of it is about the pathways. You talked about frailty, and you've invested a lot in the pathway. One of the blocks for general practice, and it comes back to the care homes issue, is the fact that care homes cannot refer directly into the frailty pathway or the falls pathway. They can't refer directly to district nurses. So there are blocks in the system that make our job more difficult. And that's not about funding, but it's about sort of listening and saying, actually, we recognise this is a problem. And actually, by readjusting a pathway, that means that workload wouldn't come back to the GP that can just pass straight through. They've had a fall, they need to go to the falls clinic. So it's not all about money. It is about listening to things that, little bits that might make us different, make our lives easier. But I think, we probably have to come together and come up with the bigger agenda items and prioritise those.
And again, if that was a priority, Alistair, I'd be happy again to go into sort of say, we've got 5-10 things we really want to see, and actually how we're going to work different across the system. But again, it's like I need some kind of consensus, like a bit of a manifesto in terms of these are the things we really want to see change, and actually how do we start to work on those. So happy to talk to you about how we can do that.
Okay, thanks. I think Mike, I think you're next up.
Hi everybody, thanks for everyone's comments. I guess I'd first of all say something positive. It's really great to be in a city where we're ahead of the curve, we're trying things, and we're all talking about what to do differently, and that's backed by having really motivated partners, great networks, and we've got PCS behind us. But the other thing in the room is it's really hard at the moment, and we've got to be realistic. And I echo some people's comments there that if we don't look after the base unit of partners looking after practices, all those other things don't work. There are no networks if there aren't practices, one. And if we aren't having those partners holding risk within practices, we can't work. You know, there isn't, if I'm not going to work and hold some risk and say who doesn't go to hospital, it doesn't really work. So we've got to support those base units, get bread and butter right before we do other things. And I guess we've talked about elephants in the room. If the elephant in the room is what we're saying is that there's 7 million people in a waiting list that we're helping tread water in general practice. There's 120 million deficit at the ICB in terms of resource in Sheffield. Should we be talking about what we don't do, what we can't do anymore? And that's really difficult because we're all optimistic people. That's why we're on a call at Thursday evening at 8 o'clock. But is part of this, if we've got less money and we're thinning our risk takers, our staff that are holding responsibility, do we have to talk about what we can't do anymore or what we're not able to do anymore? A realistic conversation. And I appreciate that's playing out at a national level, but locally, what should we not be doing if we don't have the money to do it and to pay for it? Thanks.
I think that's a really good point. And again, I come back to, this isn't just about medical model, clinical model. It's actually all of the things that come through your doors that are around poverty, you know, social, and, you know, how people aren't coming. So they come to you as a trusted person to answer all their problems. And often it's not a medical referral they need. You know, we know neurodiversity, things like that are through the roof. So I think it's about understanding, you know, how do we work with national, local government and other public sector partners to sort of address these things, because health can't act alone in this space. And I think we've tried to for so long, because it's free at the point of use. People know, you know, they trust the doctors, but actually you're coping with so much more than you should be in a sense, because of society. And again, it's so, and I know Anna made the point about the non-medical, and it's really, really important, I think, that we think about that moving forward.
Thanks. Is that one of the Normingtons?
One of the Normingtons, it's Nikki. I've got a couple of things, but I'll try not to take up too much time. The first one is just touching what Emma has been speaking about in terms of what do we want from primary care, and that primary care is really important in Sheffield. I've met Emma a couple of times, and I've met Ian sort of quite a few times now as my role as locality manager, and I can absolutely sort of back up the fact that they have fought tooth and nail to keep sort of primary care the focus in Sheffield. I think it might take some time for us to realise how well they've done, really, compared to some of the other parts of South Yorkshire. And I think that it needs to be recognised. It's not some, I'm not just saying it because Emma's one of my bosses on here. Tom's on here as well, but one of my bosses on here. But I do know there's been some difficult conversations to keep sort of that primary care focus in Sheffield. But my second one is, I suppose it's elephant in the room again. We've got more elephants than London Zoo tonight, haven't we? I think we've said that about 5 or 6 times, but something I hope we touched on a little bit more is how fragmented we are in Sheffield and how difficult that makes Emma and Ian's job in terms of relaying the sort of the voice of primary care back up into the higher echelons, into NHS England. If we're being really, really honest, we have got so many layers in Sheffield, which should make us really strong. But we've got as individual practices again, which I mention again, and I'll not apologise for mentioning. We might not be the prettiest part of the structure, but if you speak to a builder, you know, the ugliest bricks always go at the bottom to make things strong, but they're the most important bit, and that is the individual practices. So we've got the individual practices. We've then got PCNs, who are, unfortunately for Sheffield, I'm old enough and long enough in the tooth to remember when we were GP associations and neighbourhoods that were concentrating on integrated work 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And if the PCN national contract had not come in, I think we would have been further along in the integrated neighbourhood working than we are now. I think PCNs are now focused on ensuring the PCN contract is, though the boxes are ticked, to ensure the funding's there to keep the PCNs going, unfortunately. So we've got the PCNs, then we've got the localities, and then we've got PCS, we've got the ICB, we've got all these structures. And unfortunately, I would suggest over the last year or so that those structures have not worked together. And apologies, we've also got the LMC as well. I don't want Dave messaging me after this thing, so apologies, David. It's getting late. It's been a long day. And the LMC as well. But we've got so many structures in Sheffield, which should make us really strong and have the voice of everyone in Sheffield. But we don't connect, we don't join together. And I'm not saying that we should all agree all the time, but there should be an agreement that what we're saying is the best for primary care. I think it's unfortunate we've got 25 minutes left and we've not touched on it, but I think there's the big piece of work now moving forward. Now that we know what we've got left in Sheffield after all the movement around the ICB in terms of the resource, the biggest piece of work for me is bringing all those voices together to make sure everybody's heard from bottom up, and the right people are sat in the right places to put forward the voice of primary care. At the moment, I don't think it is, and I think the people that are suffering most of the practices, and obviously then the patients, and it's sad. I think at the moment, I think individual practices feel disconnected and adrift at the moment, more so than ever in the last 2 or 3 years. I've practice managers on the telephone nearly in tears because they care so much about how they're delivering their practices and their services, and they just can't do it because of various different things. And I think as leaders in Sheffield, various different leaders, very different organisations, we need to come together and make sure that doesn't continue, or we will not move forward, will not improve. Practices will suffer and patients will suffer.
So how do you think we should do that, Nikki? Because obviously, I know these sessions will start to saying, how do we truly get the voice of primary care? Not necessarily PCNs, but actually, where's the mandate? And I'm not talking about the LMC. That's, obviously there's a mandate there. But this is about how do we get sort of, grassroots level engagement and to ensure that we are. But again, it comes back to, so what is it? Where do we want to get to? We talk, the fuller review, we've had stock take after stock take, but it's ambition. There's loads of ambition, but actually what's going to get us there? Where are the building blocks? Where do you start? What do we do first? And I think that's what I'm looking for.
Well, I think unfortunately, and I hate to, I've always looked forward in my sort of varied career. I hate to say that. I think we need to look back a little bit, and I think we need to think that I think we're running before we can walk. I think we need to invest, not in terms of finances all the time, but I think we need to concentrate on making sure that we have those building blocks strong. And I think there's going to be some difficult conversations with individual practices in terms of viability and how they deliver services and all the rest of it. But I think we need it. We've got the people in the room to have that meeting, and I think we've got the mandate. If you look at the people in the room, I think we've got the mandates from practices and from, as you say, we've got the LMC, PCS and PCNs. I think we've got the right people in the room here, or a number of them, to sit and have those difficult conversations. And I think it is going to be difficult conversations for the next 6 months or so, to make sure that when the people that are speaking on the behalf of practices, PCNs, they are the correct people, and they've got the confidence of everyone on the ground. I think that's how we move forward. I think the next 6 months is absolutely key. And if we mess this up as a city, I think we should be ashamed of ourselves for not actually getting this right. Okay. And that's not a solution particularly. Sorry, Emma, but
no. We need to think about it. But thanks, Nikki.
Okay, Lindsay.
I feel like I'm going along the same point as Nikki here, but I was going to say, how do we get this voice? Because I feel like we've had 3 meetings, and at the end of those 3 meetings, we've come up with the points that were brought tonight. And then tonight, it feels like different points have come out. Not that they weren't discussed that day, but it wasn't the same points. We were talking about PCS board the other day about how do we make sure we're doing the right thing for our shareholders. We've put our business plan out and it's voted on. But sometimes it's difficult to know what's right, because you'll talk to one group of people and they'll say, we definitely need you to do this. And then the next group of people say, what are you doing that for? We wouldn't have asked for that. And I just wonder if we need to come up with a list and vote on it, and let all the practices vote on it and say, these are the things that we are focusing on this year, so that we have a united voice, because I don't think that fragmentation helps us at all.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. Tom?
So, I think this speaks to various people's points. We've just heard it from Nikki. We've heard Ben put a challenge in about organisation and what NHS England might want to see, and Lee mentioned it right up at the front in the first discussion. I think absolutely we have to be able to bring this voice together. I think the workshops are great because they start to set out a list of priorities. Otherwise, we just become a point for the rest of the system to engage with, and we don't want that. We want to have our own priorities that we can use a group to drive. I think the group has to bring together the voice across the different layers of scale, and we should be open about the fact that we do have slightly different lenses. That's not a weakness. That is just a variety of opinion, but we need a way to constructively bring those different lenses together, to disagree in private and then agree in public. And we need to treat each other compassionately when we do that. We're all working together for the same thing, so let's be compassionate with each other. we need to understand those anxieties and the worries. They're really important. And I think they start to become the terms of engagement of any group. That a group has to represent across those layers. So federation, PCN, practice, potentially localities. But then we have a terms of engagement that sits around that, around how we interact with each other. And I think that's a really big job that we need to do and get on with. And then we have a much greater chance of being able to be effective with our agenda. I mean, that's the main point I want to make. I can't help also but pick up, Nikki, I think it is unfair to say that we are behind because of PCN DES. You know, it's unfair to say that in this forum. PCNs in Sheffield have made huge strides. Prior to that, we had neighbourhoods, which was a great building block, but was essentially unfunded. And there's been a huge amount of development and commitment by the PCNs. So I think it is unfair to say that we would have been further ahead without the PCN DES. I think we need to recognise that the work that has gone in, while I appreciate that people do have different lenses on this and come at it from different perspectives.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in without putting my hand up. Sorry, just to reply back to Tom. It was not that I'm not disrespecting PCNs. I think they've done some fantastic work, and I work really closely with a couple of the PCNs. My point is that we were quite far into the neighbourhood working around district nurses, mental health and everything before the PCN DES came in. I think the PCN DES, unfortunately, the nationally has been forced on us to put a lot of resource into ticking boxes to ensure that we earn money to keep the PCNs going. I think it's been an unfortunate national distraction that we didn't need in Sheffield, even though we needed the funding for the neighbourhoods at the time.
Yeah. And I think, you know, nobody, I don't particularly like the DES. I don't like, you know, again, it just forces people down, you know, routes, and, you know, rather than thinking about what we want to do, you know, how much money have we got? What can we do with it? How much more do we need? Rather than just being forced down all these routes for these bits of money, that rather than actually, what is it we need to support general practice in the future? And again, that's what I know it's like feels like a really big question, but what I wanted to do through this work was to just say, right, these are the 5 things that general practice really want us to get behind. And for the first, it might be the first 5 things, and then we start to do something else. But actually, there's a consensus there that if we can try and turn the dial on some of these things, it's going to start to make the biggest impact, and then we can kind of build on that. As I say, I'm not naive to think we can solve all these issues, you know, in 6 months, 12 months time. But it's about having a really strong direction of travel that we're all behind. Like Tom said, we might see it through slightly different lenses, but it makes it easier for me to then try and make a business case for why would we put resource here, why would we support it, because everyone's behind it.
Okay, Ollie.
Me next, yeah. I'm going to stick my neck out a bit here and put a bit more grit in the oyster, really. And I mean, I've been a GP in the city for 20 years as a partner, and I really, really care about the city. But what I want to put on the table is that we know the medical model doesn't work well for long-term conditions, and we are evolving as a health intelligence. And I think we've got to challenge ourselves to do something differently. And now, I mean, of course, I'm going to say that because to some degree, I've got a vested interest in non-medical approaches. But we've got to be prepared to reflect on why are people investing in the hospitals and not us. The hospitals do the medical model really, really well, and they've create a really cogent argument for why you should invest in us and do that. We're only going to draw funding out of the hospitals if we can show we can do something different. The opportunity that we've got is to show that we can do, not chuck out the medical model, we can do it really well. We can bring the aspects of the medical model that work into a holistic long-term condition approach. And I'm sorry, but protecting a kind of GP-led medical model is not going to help us in my view. And you can shoot me down, but I think I'm looking for something new here for us to get investment into primary care.
Thanks, Ollie. Andy?
Thanks. Really boring, I'm sorry, but governance is boring, but equally it's really important. And I go back to what I said at the beginning of the evening, which is trust, and we need to trust each other across sort of all the different components of the general practice system in Sheffield. We've got an LMC with an elected committee and an elected executive team. PCS has a set of articles which dictates how it behaves with its shareholders. We have a board that's elected from each of the 4 localities, and a way to sort of hold us to account. And I think that's the important bit of any any future sort of decision-making structure for general practice, there needs to be a way for those that represent the majority. And clearly we can't all turn up to all meetings. We need a few people to be able to be in those different forums, but they need to be had to have a mandate. They need to be we need to be able to hold them to account for that mandate, and they need to be able to engage and seek the views of the wider GP community. And ultimately, whatever there is an independent contract, individual partnerships will make decisions about their individual businesses, and that's absolutely the way it should be. But hopefully, if we can get to a point where the decisions that we're making are sort of well engaged on, and the people that are representing are well trusted and can be held to account, we can have that collective voice that allows us to support, you know, Emma and Ian to shift resource from one part of the system into community and general practice.
Thanks, Andy. David?
Yeah, and I think it's really just, I don't know, am I on mute? No, it's just coming back on Emma's point about who is the real voice of general practice. And I suppose, obviously, I would say that the LMC is the most representative one, but, you know, there are 75 people roughly on this meeting tonight. There are probably over 500 GPs in Sheffield, and it's how do you get that engagement of the grassroots GPs, and how do you get that engagement of the salaried doctors and of the local GPs? And I do think we have a strong group of medical leaders. It's about having mutual respect between ourselves and working together and talking together about what's best for the city. I suppose my perspective is, which I think is slightly what Nikki's saying as well, is that there are lots of different groups having the same discussions. You have the clinical directors, you have PCS, you have the ICB, you have the LMC, and I suppose I would be suggesting a forum of those medical leaders discussing some of the way ahead, and then maybe going back to Lindsay's idea of taking that way ahead out to all GPs across the city, because I think you have to remember that PCS represent practices and clinical directors represent networks, and there's an awful lot of other GPs and other members of staff out there. Thank you.
Thanks. So we've got Alex, Helen, and Rosie, I think it is. So we've got maybe a couple of minutes each because we'll have to be rounding things up.
Thank you. I'll try and talk quickly. Cheers. So mine is a little bit less medical because I'm not medical. It's a bit processy. Apologies for that. But we've opened up total triage, and we have significantly more people coming through the door. And I don't understand, if everyone hasn't opened that, how do we know in Sheffield what the total size of the demand is? How many people actually want to come into our building? And if we don't know how many people need to come in, how do we know the size of the estate? I can't get my head around that as you know, in terms of the building blocks at the bottom of it. That's me as a process engineer for 10 years. As a builder for the last 6 years, you cannot spend 7 years designing a building if you want to make this work. It's ludicrous. Our projects have been with the ICB for 7 years. It's still not off the ground. That needs to end. You can fix that just by putting the right people in the right place. That's not a difficult one. And a husband of a partner, you can't underestimate the value the partners play in that team in terms of, as someone said earlier, the risk they hold and the above and beyond when the doors close at 6 and everything else that needs to happen with the partners to put their head down and get it working. So just want to throw those three in. Thank you.
I mean, thank you. Obviously, I can't sort of speak for the last 7 years, but you know, I'm here to try and, you know, to move this on. That's why I'm here tonight. So I'll be interested in some of that, and I'm sure people will guide me in that space. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Rosie, a couple of minutes.
Thank you. I haven't got answers, but I think from all of that's been said, and particularly what Emma was saying, the thing that at the end of a working career frustrates me is that whilst I feel my skills are probably best used in complex care and continuity of care and all the things we value, actually most of my stress is from recruiting and reorganising and rescheduling and the moving of the goalposts. I think the enhanced service model, whilst I realise we do have to change, and that we're very performance driven and target driven, means that we use a lot of time on things that we're not best skilled at, which I think is one of the strengths of the sort of the PCS concept, that actually there is economy of scale. But I wonder if the ICB could perhaps look at what the resourcing of some of the enhanced services, some of the PCN issues are, to make some of those savings, because I think we find we spend a lot of time and therefore probably money, although it may not be paid, in doing things we're not best suited to in the recruiting, in the HR, which was very predictable when starting up the networks, unfortunately. and we've seen this process over a working lifetime happen approximately every 10 years, that we reinvent the same wheel. I can't remember all the initials of them, but that actually, if we are going to be able to do the picking out the complex from the simple, and the continuity of care and the end of life care, which a lot of us value, and have time for the patients who aren't going to earn us money, then I think the worry about jumping over the hurdles and, balls through hoops, and to actually get enough money to pay the staff, actually diverts a massive amount of clinical valuable time away from what is really needed, especially if we've got to train twice as many doctors to come in a very short period of time. I mean, I take Ollie's point that the medical model isn't the only thing, but I think if we're looking at, I feel as though I'm looking at moving the deck chairs on the Titanic a little bit, and I think we're just not using our clinical strengths if we're having to firefight trying to keep something on the rails, which is, for me personally, feels like it's sort of heading off a little bit. So I wonder if the ICB could, I mean, it's a national issue, obviously, but looking at what our contractual requirements are. I know we have to change, I'm not very good at it, but the contractual requirements divert an massive amount of clinical time away from clinical work. And it is perhaps the issue that you mentioned, that secondary care has a massive infrastructure. If primary care was, working to that scale, it would be costing several times as much as it does. So I suppose that would be my plea, that actually clinicians who are good at clinical work, and there's always people who will not do clinical work, but we really need to release them to actually do the supervising, the training, the patient care and the continuity. No answers, just questions.
Thanks, Rosie. So Krishna and Laura, 30 seconds each, because I know you've not spoken. It'd be great to hear from you, but we also need to round up. And
sure, Ben. Thanks, Ben. Mine's a very brief point, and Ham, nice to see you. I was just going to say, I think that, having heard colleagues, there's only one point that I wanted to mention, which I also said at the workshops, and having been in GP in different parts of Yorkshire and having done other bits and pieces, so far I've never come across anybody who can argue against the value of continuity of care. So, I mean, you asked for 5 different things that general practice can get behind in Sheffield. I don't have 5, I only have 1, but and I suspect everybody will get behind that, because it adds value to the quality of care that the patients are receiving. It improves the job satisfaction for the individual clinicians and others who work in general practice. And at a system level, there's backloads of evidence that shows it actually makes efficiencies across the system, decreases hospital admissions, any attendances, as well as helping people live longer. So I think whichever model we want to look at and what we want to get behind, if the underlying principle is any policy that comes through locally, is this going to improve continuity of care? That answers it. And if it's not, we shouldn't back it.
Absolutely. Okay, Laura, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we've had quite a task force here in this group, and I think it's been interesting tonight. It's been a bit heavy, understanding what it all means. But I think as a nurse and as the representation that we've had in these groups, it's been great. And I just think if we've got voices from all services, maybe this is something that we need to keep going, and we be the task force. I don't know if that's the right word, but to get the ideas together and to give each other, like, narrow it down and say, right, like the things that we're already working on separately while it's there.
Great, thank you, Laura. So, and I don't know if you want to say anything last, Emma, and then Andy, Alistair, to round things up.
I mean, it's been really helpful to hear, and it was helpful to hear some of the discussion before. Obviously, I spoke, but as I say, I'm really committed to doing something in primary care. I recognise the pressures people face, but it would be helpful for me if we could have some kind of consensus, not about everything, but some things that I could then perhaps go into battle for, whether it's pathways, whether it's around leses, whether it's around, the wider workforce, non-medical issues we've talked about, but, just to give us some, as Nikki said, there are layers, helpful layers, but actually how do we bring it all together? How do we make sense of it? And how are we going to start to make a difference to ensure we can attract, retain, and keep the level of primary care that we would want in Sheffield, but also think about the opportunities that primary care at scale for some things might offer us as well. But as I said, really flexible about the models and the partnership models. It doesn't matter to me. It's about, what matters is what it's a sum of the parts, isn't it? As somebody said, if we haven't got strong practices, we haven't got strong PCNs, etc. So that's all I want to say. But thanks very much for everyone's input so far.
Thanks, Emma. Perhaps just to say a couple of words before we close, and I don't know whether Alistair wants to say a couple of words. I mean, how do you sum up that the last sort of couple of hours? A huge amount to reflect on, I think, for us all. I probably should start by just thanking everybody for contributing and for giving up your time. It just demonstrates the fact that there's 76, 78 people on a call on a Thursday evening. We do care passionately about what we do, which is really, really important. Thanks to all the speakers, not least to Emma. I hope we haven't been too tough on you, Emma. I think what some of the reflections of things I've heard this evening, a really strong voice around how much people value the autonomy and local agency that working at a practice level gives us, that responsiveness to patients and that continuity of care, which you'll be pleased, Krish, I'd scribbled down before you mentioned it again, and again that came out in the workshop, so good that we're consistent. Something around the real importance of supporting individual practices as the smallest units of delivery. Without those foundations, we can't do anything. Again, something about strength in numbers. I think Ollie mentioned it before, but actually, if we don't work together, we are disparate as a GP community. If we work together, we're really powerful. There's been a range of discussions around the layers of scale, and certainly in the chat, some stuff about the broader services. So not necessarily undermining what practices do, but thinking about resilience around sort of out of hours care, GPC, etc. There's a few comments in the chat there around that sort of thing, research, etc. So again, some food for thought around some of the things that we can do at scale, that is the supportive infrastructure that allows practices to bring their A game, as I say. And then finally, a suggestion from David and Lindsay around perhaps some of the key leaders going away and coming up with some options around how we do get some collective decision making as providers, and maybe even coming back to colleagues and putting that to some sort of vote using whatever sort of governance infrastructure we've currently got through the LMC and PCS. So yeah, a lot to think about, but thank you.
And again, thanks everyone for presenting, everyone for turning up and that as well. I think what I'm hearing, I think it's probably sort of Andy's last point. What I'm hearing from Emma is that there's an open door, but we need to have a voice that says, actually, these are our priorities. And I think the issue there is, as a city, we all have our individual priorities, whether it's our practices, networks, and that. But actually, how do we come together to say, okay, well, what are our major priorities? And I think we've discussed an awful lot of the meeting today. And I actually think that's probably the main thing that we need to take away from this meeting, is to be able to come together as a group of providers and sort of engage, whether it's through, as Andy says, PCS, the LMC, engage with the practices and the networks to say, okay, let's have a list of priorities. work within the group to say, what are we going to come up with, top 4 or 5, and then go back to Emma and Ian and say, okay, these are the sorts of things that we want to change across the city. And, you know, they won't be everybody's top pick, but actually we've got to start somewhere. And I think the issue is that we've got to come together as a group of providers and say, actually, you know, we've got to engage with the sort of the business end, the practices, the networks, the ARS roles, everybody working in those, but then have some consensus to take up to you, Emma, and to Ian, and say, this is what we want to do.
We're trying to be as flexible as possible, you know, so as I say, as long as we've got the total place resource, that gives us flexibility. So again, you know, when you're in your, some of you in your South Yorkshire meetings, again, it's just about ensuring that we really, Sheffield sounds very parochial, but we do have a voice in that, making sure we keep our total resource in place so we can invest it differently.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, everybody. I'm sure we'll carry on this discussion, and we'll go away and try and work out next steps and communicate it as soon as possible, so that it's not just been a meeting that happens and then you don't hear anything. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll be in touch. Have a good evening, everybody.